TGC Requiem, this is Shadow Fae, or Shadow Fairies, depending on what you want to say. I'll probably call it Shadow Fae, just because it rolls off the tongue a little bit easier. But this is basically what I have found to date to be kind of the best version of Sultai Shadow. That doesn't mean that it is the best version of Shadow, but I feel like there's a lot of room to play with Shadow, and I mean I've definitely seen people playing Grixis Shadow lists, and Sultai being my favorite color combination, I wanted to try and come up with it, and somehow it just kind of, I mean I've seen Bitter Blossom play with Shadow decks before, but somehow it hit me the other night. Spell Stutter Sprite. Let's run Spell Stutter Sprite with it. So what we have here is we have the core Death Shadow deck. You got your Death Shadow as your big hammer, minus X, where X is your life total. So you can get them up to, you say, as big as a 12/12. You have Tarmogoyf, who is a 0/1, but he grows based on the types of cards in your graveyard. Well, the big thing here, Bitter Blossom plays well with both of these cards. There's synergy with Death Shadow, because at the beginning of your upkeep, you would lose one life and create a 1/1 black fairy token, fairy rogue creature token with flying. Well, the cool thing here is it gives you the ability to do kind of like a slow burn to yourself versus being so aggressive, versus Death Shadow, or to get your Death Shadows bigger. Same token, you have tribal enchantment, so you have your tribal ability and your enchantment ability as ways to increase the size of your Tarmogoyf. Now, with the previous versions of Sultai Death Shadow that I played, Sultai Shadows, the problem I have found with the deck is the deck does not have the ability to close very well. You don't have a Temur Battle Rage, you can't traverse for a Gore-Clan Rampager, and so what ends up happening is you might just get grinded out or give your opponent too much time to get around you. Well, the idea here is that, one, you're not doing as much damage to yourself quite as fast with Death Shadow in this build, so maybe you can just grind your creatures with big attacks for a little bit longer. The other thing is with Bitter Blossom, you're basically getting wider than your opponent, so your opponent basically, the idea or the hope is, can't effectively get around your creatures, which means if they can't effectively attack you, and they're getting attacked back with large Death Shadows or Tarmogoyfs, then ideally they are going to have to leave their creatures back to block, and eventually trade off with your Death Shadows. And in the meantime, as you trade off with Death Shadows, you're either closing with Bitter Blossom, which is actually a fairly quick clock for anybody who has played Fairies before, or played against Fairies. Bitter Blossom, the first fairy gets out there, it swings for 1. The second one gets out there, you're swinging for 2. The next one for 3. The next one for 4. But it's not just 4 damage. It's 4 damage plus the 3 damage plus the 2 damage plus the 1 damage before. So it gives you ways to help close by getting wide, but also by forcing your opponent to trade, which is really what you're trying to do in these more grindy Death Shadow versions anyway. Use your bigger creatures to beat up theirs. So the other positive to this is by playing a shell with Bitter Blossom and Spell Stutter. Spell Stutter gives us a creature and counterspell together. Now, most of the stuff in the format's small enough that Spell Stutter is going to be able to counter it on its own, or with maybe a Bitter Blossom and or a Bitter Blossom token. But at the same time, it's, worst case, it's like a 1/1 blocker, but it has a high ceiling. Your opponent can, it can counter almost all of the 1 CMC removal on its own. Certainly, somebody could count or kill it in response to its own trigger to counter the spell, but point being is you're getting another creature that's buying you time for your big creatures to beat down, or again, you're letting your big creatures hold the floor while you're attacking your opponent in the air in a manner that is difficult to block. And Spell Stutter also acting as an effective counter spell. We're also playing Vendilion Click. This is kind of to help against combo and yet another way to kind of close quickly. Vendilion Click has flash. Obviously, Spell Stutter Sprite also has flash. Vendilion Click allows you to look at a player's hand, and you can pick a card from their hand and make them put on the bottom of their library and then draw a card. So you can do this against combo players to try and disrupt their draw. You can do it to yourself to try and cycle. It's a really good card, and I know probably a lot of you are thinking, only 8 fairies between Vendilion Click, Spellstutter Sprite, and Bitter Blossom. That doesn't make Spellstutter Sprite all that great. Well, here's the thing. We're playing a bunch of these cycling cards like Mishra's Bauble, Architects of Will, Street Wraith, and again our Traverses. So just like the other decks, we are condensing our deck here. We're not playing 26 lands and fairies here. We're playing 18 lands, and we have a condensed deck that allows us to get to our key powerful cards quickly. So essentially, again, while we're not playing a ton of the fairies, we're playing the best ones. We're playing the ones that are the most synergistic with what we're trying to do, and going from there. Now, I will admit I've played some matches with this, and sometimes you get some awkward draws. Granted, you get some awkward draws with Death Shadow decks in general, but you just got to be more aware of kind of how they play out, how the hands can play out together. You got to think about, similar to how fairies, it's always like when you don't have Bitter Blossom in hand, what is your game plan? Do I have a hand that can be a game plan? And thankfully, most of the time we do here, because we still have that Death Shadow Tarmogoyf package. So the other thing we're doing here, we're playing some Stubborn Denials. One of the best things about blue and Death Shadow is you have these Death Shadows and Tarmogoyfs to turn on your Stubborn Denial's Ferocious ability, making it a hard counter spell for non-creature spells at 1 blue mana. 4 Fatal Push for removal. Not a lot of removal. We're kind of trying to focus with this version more on disrupting our opponent and grinding them out, or closing on them somewhat quickly, but disrupting them more with counter magic and or by putting out threats that are really hard for them to handle. We're only running 7 hand disruption right now. We're running 3 Thoughtseize, 4 Inquisitions. It's possible that this should be a 4th Thoughtseize and 3 Inquisitions. It's also possible that we need to sorry, and I just realized my sorcery count on the deck list to the left is wrong, so I'm updating that. It's also possible we could run one more instant. I think Go for the Throat would actually be pretty decent in this deck, and I'm not quite sure what would be replaced, but I think a Go for the Throat would be good just to get another bigger removal spell in here, or to get another instant. Maybe Stubborn Denial is just the right thing. Maybe another Stubborn Denial. Regardless, I wish there was at least one more instant. Traverse the Ulenwald. We still have plenty of ways to turn on Delirium to go search for basic lands, for lands or creatures. We are only running 3 Mishra's Bauble because we are running Architects of Will. Part of the reason we are running Architects of Will 2 of versus 4 Street Wraith is that because we don't have as much removal in this deck, and maybe not quite as much closing speed, there's a little bit of an assumption that we're going to do a little more damage to ourselves, not necessarily immediately, or maybe our opponent's going to do a little more damage to us, or we're going to do our damage to ourselves a little slower over time, which one gives us access to Architects of Will, or should theoretically give us the ability to cycle Architects of Will with mana more easily, and again, making it so that we don't want to do as much damage to ourselves as fast as possible. We still want to have access to make our shadows very big very quickly, which we do have with the Street Race, potentially with Traverse, etc. But it's not necessarily an all-out game plan like it might be with the Jund decks that are really trying to close the game extraordinarily quick. Now, this doesn't mean that we can't close the game out quick. It just means we might be trying to close the game out a half turn later than them, or a turn later than them in some cases. So with the 2 architects being artifact creatures, I cut one of the baubles, so we have 5 since we have 5 artifacts. The other thing is Architects of Will is actually castable in this deck. Street Wraith is castable. Anybody who's played Shadow knows that there are games where you end up hard casting Street Wraith at 5 mana, and it's just a 3/4. Architects of Will you can cast. It's just a 3/3, but it's a 3/3 that lets you stack the top 3 draws of your deck, which is relevant. And the fact that you can cast it for 4 mana actually is relevant. Street Wraith, I often find, you're ready to cast it, but you're a land shy. You can just cast the Architects and then set up your draws for the next few turns. We're also playing 2 Lilianas just because she's best at clearing the way for Tarmogoyf and Death Shadow. And then Collective Brutality, we are playing 1. It's kind of a removal spell, obviously, but the big thing is we also want ways to pitch Bitter Blossom. It's part of what Liliana's in here for as well when we're trying to grow our Tarmogoyfs. Say it's a second one, or we just don't need the Bitter Blossom based on how the game's going. The other thing is it's a way to gain a little life to offset the Bitter Blossom. So beyond that, pretty standard mana base, 11 fetches, 4 shocks, and 3 basics. I don't love the 3 basics, and maybe it's best that one of these becomes just another shock or another fetch. But depending on what you're playing against, if you think you're playing a Blood Moon opponent, we do actually need access to all 3 colors, and so having access to all 3 basics is kind of the plan there. By the way, is this not the most beautiful swamp of all time? I'm sure you have noticed that this is my swamp of choice. In the sideboard, pretty standard stuff with the Fulminator Mages, Maelstrom Pulse, Abrupt Decay, just extra removal. It is also possible Abrupt Decay should be in the main as the 7th instant, and that Go for the Throat might be a sideboard card, but again, the deck's still kind of in early-ish development. 2 Liliana the Last Hope, for all the reasons that she's great. Typically it's going to be the killing small creatures or returning creatures to your hand for the grind approach. Sometimes it's going to be going for the ultimate to just beat your opponent over the head with 2/2 zombies. Collective Brutality to help against burn, and pretty much is just there for burn. I mean, let's be honest. Extra hand disruption against decks like Scape Shift, where you need to hit something that costs more than 3 CMC. Surgical Extraction, great for extracting cards that have been disrupted with hand disruption. It's also great for getting like Tron lands with a Fulminator Mage. I also am a huge fan of sticking with the triple Surgical Extraction in these builds, because with Spellstutter Sprite and Stubborn Denial, which we have access to the full 4 of post board, with the Stubborn Denials, the Stubborn Denials, the hand disruption, and some removal, you have the potential to Surgical Extract just anything. So I'm a big fan of that. 1 Snapcaster post board. It's possible that should just be in the main deck with the Vendilion Click on the side, or both Vendilion Clicks on the side, but I mean, again, we're still really trying to figure out the exact appropriate build here. And then we have a second Vendilion Click on the side, again, just another fairy, and this is just kind of another threat to help us against combo decks. We want something that's going to both disrupt them and do damage quickly. So the other thing I kind of like about this, and if opponents are wanting to bring in like Anger of the Gods against us, because we have a bunch of 1 toughness creatures, that means they're diluting their deck while we still have Death Shadow and Tarmogoyf. So I'm a big fan. Again, we are also only running 3 Traverse. Part of the reason we're only running 3 Traverse here was we're actually getting extra threats in the deck with Bitter Blossom and Spellstutter Sprite, the Vendilion Click, and even the Architects of Will. And so I just didn't feel the 4th Traverse was as necessary based on the threat package. But this is Shadow Faeries, whatever you want to call it. We're going to run through a league, and hopefully it plays as well for me there as it's been playing for me outside of leagues.